I read Elizabeth Warren's election promises, so you don't have to. She is the woman who runs with the tagline, "I have a plan for that." Her plans are posted on the internet where anyone can read them over. Some of them are very precise and detailed and actionable, and some of them are more vague statements of principle. All of them have a lot of platitudes and election rhetoric rolled up with them, but hey, it is an election. Can you blame her? Point 1, she promises to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Exactly the same promise made by Bernie Sanders. I think it's going to mobilize exactly the same level of voter support. The actual economic, social, and political consequences of this, nobody has dealt with yet. Nobody has even thought it through, I can say. For San Francisco and Seattle, the impacts of a $15 an hour minimum wage are easy to foresee and are much more positive than negative. What about Louisiana? What about smaller cities and rural areas throughout the United States where this is going to be a huge change in the rate paid per hour? What are the impacts going to be on farming? It could just result in much more of the labor used in the farm sector becoming black market, illegal immigrant labor, so on and so forth. So there will be both negative and positive economic impacts of this reform. And the other kind of issue haunting both the Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren campaigns is this question of how anti-neoliberal they are, how anti-China they are. If you increase the hourly rate for every factory and every farm in the United States to $15 an hour, does that mean that poor people in America will just buy more and more of their goods imported from China, imported from Bangladesh, imported from countries where the hourly rate of labor is dramatically lower? So it could exacerbate some of the economic problems we already have, while obviously solving other problems. I don't see anyone thinking that through, doing the math, or making projections of the knock-on consequences of a $15 an hour minimum wage, probably because until recently nobody really thought it would be accomplished. But having a $15 an hour minimum wage at a national level, at a federal level, is a very, very different thing from just passing it in, say, downtown Seattle, downtown San Francisco, other very, very high paid and very, very high rent areas of the United States of America. She has extensive and detailed plans for labor reform to strengthen the role of unions in the United States of America, unionized labor. I think she put many years of thought into this, and she probably availed herself of the huge number of academic experts in the United States who spent their whole careers sharpening their knives, looking ahead to the day when they might be able to pass these kinds of reforms. There's both good and bad when you get into the details. I think she would establish a system that, although well-intentioned, will be very susceptible to corruption. And by the way, anti-corruption, a huge part of her platform, certainly would be an interesting experiment. With the United States, the state of organized labor is right now at such a low ebb that probably any reform will be an improvement. It's very difficult to imagine her reforms making the situation worse. And, if it doesn't work out, 4 years, 8 years down the line, you can make adjustments. You can figure it out as you go. But that is not the kind of policy that's going to mobilize support in a simple way. Probably industry by industry, you're going to have experts looking through those reforms and saying, well, this won't work for this reason. This will create this problem. Sector by sector, it's a sort of very complex and difficult to implement systemic reform that will be met with a lukewarm response, probably by both employers and employees. Anyway, well-intentioned. Economic patriotism, point 3 on this list. Economic patriotism, meaning protectionism, meaning opposition to free trade with China. The computer I'm using to record this video was assembled in China. A large percentage of all the things I own and that I've bought in the last 20 years were made in China. Does economic patriotism mean that Americans will cease to buy goods imported from China? China is not the only country with a question mark on it. Will Americans stop buying gasoline exported from Saudi Arabia? these are questions with tremendous far-reaching implications for people's daily life and for the world economy. She has set down a very incoherent set of principles that she will link trade. She will link the right of foreign countries to have trade agreements with the United States or to have trade with the United States to the status of human rights and political freedoms in those countries. So obviously China would be the big loser. If you actually took this plan as it currently exists now and put it into action without any further refinement, well, there would be winners and losers. The obvious winner would be Japan. So are you actually open to allowing the Japanese to import unlimited numbers of Japanese cars to the United States and destroy the American auto sector? It's only one example, but it's a pretty tremendous example. The other big winner would be India. India is a democracy. They meet all these standards. So are you going to allow Americans to buy all kinds of stuff, like clothing, cheaply manufactured in India? India is not manufacturing the computers that Americans use yet. But if you do this, if you take on this trade reform, within 10 years, they're going to be manufacturing a lot of the electronics Americans use. They'll take over market share from China. There'll be a transition to people using cellular phones and all kinds of things made in India instead of China, especially if the minimum wage is going to be $15 an hour in the United States. So this would be a huge shift globally from trade with the countries that currently do not meet the standards for democracy and human rights that she wants to impose, a shift over to economic reliance on and trade with countries that do meet those minimum standards. It's pretty vague. It's pretty incoherent what this means. And nobody is doing the math and thinking through what will this actually mean for consumers in the United States of America. Donald Trump has had really a very mild anti-China trade regime, but even he stopped short of denying Americans the opportunity to buy a new Nintendo video game console this Christmas. And so, some of the tariffs have been delayed in their implementation until after the Christmas export season is done. Nintendo, they now manufacture the video game consoles that are exported to the United States in Vietnam rather than China. There are factories right now relocating from China to Vietnam. Others are relocating from China to Taiwan, Malaysia, and elsewhere. Well, Vietnam is also a communist dictatorship. So it's not really a net benefit for democracy and human rights to relocate these industries from China to Vietnam, but that's what's been going on. So, the impacts, short-term and long-term, of Elizabeth Warren's principle of so-called economic patriotism, there will be advantages and disadvantages. I think that this part of her plan, she herself probably has not really given enough thought to. But hey, it's an extensive policy document we're talking about here. Believe me, this is a cogent summary. We're talking about less than 10% of the text in this video. Another principle, she wants workers, employees, to elect at least 40% of board members at big American corporations. At least. I think what she means is at most. Can you imagine if the employees at Disneyland were more than 40% of the voting shareholders? It would certainly transform the American economy in many ways if at Walmart and Disney corporations, if the majority of voting members were not the investors, but were the employees. That would transform capitalism as we know it. If it's 40% rather than 51%, that's a very different thing. Interesting, idealistic proposal for a very fundamental economic reform. You'd then have corporations in the position of very directly trying to bully their workers and explain to them why they can't pay them higher wages or why they have to shut down a certain factory and fire everyone at that factory. It would change corporate culture in America profoundly if 40% of the board members at all corporations were employees. I can think of both advantages and disadvantages to it. If I could wave my magic wand and make it happen, sure, I'd do it. I might make it 30%. I don't know. If it's above 50%, then you're creating a situation in which the employees are the owners, and there's unbelievable danger in terms of corruption. So again, I mentioned this before with her promised reforms about strengthening unions. To say this is susceptible to corruption is an understatement. It's idealistic to think that the employee at Starbucks, the rank and file employee, the guy sitting at the front cash register, is directly making corporate decisions. He's not. There's going to be an unbelievably indirect, undemocratic, non-transparent, and corruptible relationship between the guy who works at the front counter at Starbucks and the people who are actually in the boardroom dealing with the corporate owners or attending board meetings, right? If you think American party politics are corruptible, there are no journalists covering that stuff. There's no transparency. There's no public accountability for how it is that just a couple of employees end up being the representatives of the workers. And among the things that can corrupt them are just the owners of the company themselves. What if the owners of Disneyland take aside those few employees and make sure they have an understanding about what's in the company's best interest? So it's corruptible, it's unreliable, it's dangerous, it's not transparent, it's not publicly accountable, it's never going to be truly democratic. So it creates a lot of interesting questions. However, those questions are worth answering. I mean, there are really profound and interesting questions about inequality in the workplace. Let's keep real. Corporations include hospitals. Who should make the decisions at the hospitals? Greedy investors, what's the captains of industry, mustache-twirling bankers and stockbrokers? All right, this is one stereotype. The question of who should really make the tough decisions in running and managing a hospital, it can't easily be said that the janitors and the nurses, that the lower paid, least powerful people, that the workers, that the working class of the hospital are going to make the right decisions. Obviously, you have a very complex situation there involving a lot of expert knowledge. It's expert knowledge that maybe the surgeons have and the janitors don't have or the nurses don't have. Expert knowledge that maybe an economist has, or maybe actually a stockbroker, a financier, an investment banker, someone with that kind of specialized economic knowledge, economic learning. They may have certain knowledge that the nurses and the janitors and the people who answer the phones, the secretaries, working hospitals, that they don't have. So if 40% of the people at those corporate meetings, they have that worker's perspective, yes, but they may be lacking a lot of the expertise that's really needed to sit on that board and make those tough decisions. So it's going to raise a lot of really interesting questions about inequality within the workplace, inequality of education, and who gets to make the decisions, how they're made. And on a cultural level, if you really had this political reform and you stuck with it as a society, you'd learn how to work together, you'd learn how to run a corporation when 40% of the people at those meetings are lower level employees. And you'd have a lot of problems with corruption. I warn you. Still, interesting idea, idealistic. Be nice to see where it goes. Okay, canceling up to $50,000 in student loan debt for 95% of people who have it. So there are a few little weasel words in here, but this is very similar to Bernie Sanders' promise to cancel student loan debt. So billions of dollars would be handed out to people who have already completed university, but who are in debt to the universities for the cost of their education. 95% of people, a discount of up to $50,000. So a slight variation on the promises made by Bernie Sanders under that heading. She has a dedicated plan to reduce the cost of rent in the United States of America. This gets into the problem of the American Constitution, what is a federal responsibility and what is a state responsibility, which she never touches. She never really deals with constitutional amendments, and many of her plans really probably require a constitutional amendment. But without amending the Constitution, she's going to create a $500 billion budget, creating 1.5 million new jobs, and an independent analysis by an economist says that this would end up reducing the cost of rent throughout the United States as a whole by about 10%. This is a realistic estimate and also tragically tells you just how little of a difference the federal government of the United States can make, at least with this $500 billion budget to improve the situation with housing. Interesting plan. I did the reading. I would prefer more of a principled approach that really asks and answers the question, what is the role of government in the housing and real estate sector, and gives a coherent answer. We really start from first principles, and probably it's going to involve an amendment to the Constitution. You do have a very fundamental conflict of interest in that the government doesn't feel that it's in its interest to be counter-cyclical, that it's not in the government's interest to lower the value of property, of houses, to be blunt. They don't feel it's in their interest to lower the value of the cost of rent. Instead, the government makes more and more money through pro-cyclical policies, through having this ever upward, ever increasing cost of both buying and selling residential property and rent. But anyway, this is a kind of stopgap Band-Aid solution, $500 billion Band-Aid, that would result in a 10% reduction in the cost of rent by these estimates. Nationwide program to provide universal, affordable childcare for all children aged 0 to 5. Not free. Japan has free childcare, 0 to 5. They have free preschool, whatever, free, free nursery school. What's the word for this? Something new. Anyway, free early childhood childcare is available. But this isn't free. This is just universal and affordable. So a little bit vague. But again, this would be a multi-billion-dollar commitment. Again, not really the federal government's responsibility as opposed to state government. Maybe you want to take that up with the Constitution. What is, under the American Constitution, what is the role of the federal government in providing daycare to children aged 0 to 5? Did the Founding Fathers think that one through? Making tuition free, note the wording, tuition free at every public technical school, 2-year college, and 4-year college. So I'm guessing the difference between a college and a university starts to be, I'm guessing there's some unstated fine print, but some kind of sweeping reformed education that would make tuition cost-free in many institutions a lot of the time. I have my doubts as to whether or not that's going to include Ivy League universities. I don't know the scope of that. But in any case, good intentions. You at home, get out your calculators and estimate how much these policies would cost if we added them all up. Medicare for all, free healthcare for everyone. This is basically identical to Bernie Sanders' plan, from what I can see. But anyway, so her healthcare plan, in one sentence, is a promise of Medicare for all. A $100 billion budget to quote-unquote end the opioid crisis, drug addiction. I've seen her detailed breakdown of the budget. In my opinion, it is complete bullshit. Nevertheless, interesting that she cares, interesting that she's committed to making a difference. And, I would just sort of vaguely hope that if she has that commitment, has that interest, at some point, this would be refined into something more effective, that the tough questions would be asked about the future of drug policy in America, how to really solve these problems. But anyway, it's good that she cares. You can definitely be elected President of the United States just by coming out and saying that you care and saying that you want to solve the problem. Not all of these plans really deserve to be called plans. In some cases, they're just commitments to, commitments to solving a problem one way or another, and a commitment to spending up to $100 billion doing it. Her heart's in the right place. I mean, again, I'm a snob. I look at these things as someone who really cares about political philosophy and political science. But these policies don't have to live up to my snobbish high standards. Fundamentally, she just has to have a package of policies that are better than Joe Biden and are better than Donald Trump. And I think if you guys are following along and making a list of these policies, we go, it's pretty clear she's already got a better package of policies than either of those two guys. A $2 trillion investment in American green research, meaning ecology, meaning climate change, meaning air pollution, water pollution, etc. $2 trillion over 10 years. So that's going to be a lot less than $1 trillion per year, right? It's maybe going to be $0.2 trillion. $2 trillion spread out over 10 years. That is a definite contrast to Bernie Sanders' $16 trillion plan, which I believe is supposed to be spread out over 15 years in his case. They're all in the trillions, but this is a relatively modest plan to, as she says, research, manufacturing, and exporting in the so-called green sector. Again, I would warn that there's the potential for corruption there. Still, heart's in the right place. There's a general expectation that everyone on the left is going to show the depth of their commitment to coming up with real ecological solutions, to take real ecological action. So putting the number 2 trillion on it doesn't hurt. The greatest weakness of her plan is probably foreign policy. I've already mentioned that there's a lot of intentionally vague garbage about foreign policy here. I'll probably make a separate video just talking about that from one angle or another. She is committed to less military spending. She's committed to ideas like it's time for our troops to come home. We've heard this under Barack Obama before. It's not really clear what it is she's going to commit to there. And there are commitments to pay for all this, some of them vague, some of them precise and worked out in great detail, to increase taxes for the rich. And that is one policy proposal I'm absolutely certain she will stick to. So greatest weaknesses, as I read through this mess of plans, in general, I think her foreign policy is still at the stage of being a sketch on the back of a napkin. I don't think she's lying or being dishonest. I think it's just something she never really devoted much attention to, beyond very, very vague promises of peace. There's just nothing of substance there. There's no question of, are you willing to abandon South Korea so that South Korea gets conquered by North Korea? Probably not. Are you willing to abandon the U.S. military base in Okinawa, Japan, which is directly linked to South Korea and North Korea, by the way? Probably not. Are you willing to abandon the Philippines so that their outer islands get taken over by China? Probably not. When you go through the list of policy priorities, even get down to the really low U.S. military policy priorities, like, are you willing to abandon the island of Cyprus so that it gets taken over by Turkey? Probably not. So how much can you really, reduce the American military endeavor if you're not willing to make, hard decisions, hard sacrifices like that, which will include actually closing down military bases, actually giving up on wars that you haven't won, and that will cost trillions of dollars, or at least billions of dollars to win, starting from your current position in 2019 or 2020. Her criminal justice reform, I felt was a joke. Well-intentioned, thoroughly thought through, a lot of detail there. To me, that's very easy to criticize and is often laughable. So without going into detail, one would hope, again, that she moved. I mean, there are enough positive promises here to win the election. There are enough positive promises to do a lot of good in the world. But sure, long story short, the criminal justice reform is weak. The anti-corruption agenda, which she places a lot of emphasis on in her campaign, I found shockingly weak. I don't know why that is. In terms of her education, her background, and so on, and the emphasis she gives to this, I think she very correctly saw that she could distinguish herself from Bernie Sanders by putting a lot of emphasis on the anti-corruption agenda. The actual plan, as it's set down right now, is weak. It's poor, but still, heart's in the right place. And I mean, what can I tell you? It's better than the anti-corruption promises that were made by George W. Bush before he was elected. You guys remember that? George W. Bush had an anti-corruption agenda. He had an electoral reform agenda. Not a whole lot happened with that. So, yeah, but still, it's worrying. And, maybe in the months ahead, she'll come out with, something a little bit more convincing in terms of getting tough on crime, shall we say. Both crime in terms of corruption and crime in terms of conventional criminal justice reform. I would note, because it's an issue that's been in the mainstream news a lot lately, her position on gun ownership, gun rights, gun violence, incredibly weak. Just a huge hole in her policy, in my opinion. You can read her plan. Shockingly weak, poorly thought through. And again, what she's really fundamentally doing is avoiding committing to anything that would entail an amendment to the Constitution. And on some of these issues, gun violence, electoral reform, corruption, the role of corporate lobbyists in government, the role of corporate lobbyists in the military, there are many, many issues where fundamentally what she's talking about absolutely would require a constitutional amendment. Maybe that can be my positive suggestion in closing this video, is that Elizabeth Warren takes the mess of policy priorities that she now has and she refines them, she distills them, she extracts from them a short list of exactly what the amendments to the Constitution are that she would propose. Because if you want to get money out of politics, if you want to reform the electoral system, if you want to end corruption, if you want to accomplish all these things, if you want to fundamentally change the way employees relate to their employers, if you want to fundamentally change the relationship between tenant and landlord, you want to change the way Americans buy homes and go into debt, there are a lot of fundamental changes you say you want to make here. Plus, you want to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour. Plus, you want to destroy trade between the United States and China. In the name of human rights, I'm all for it. I'm all for it. But dealing with the consequences, do you have a plan for that? It would entail quite a few amendments to the American Constitution. And hey, that's what amendments are for.